What is the story about the Creativity and Culture Conference? Tell me more about that.
Right. Okay, well, let me start by explaining why I think stories are really important.
Right.
I think that's where the idea arose. So, you know, when I was a child, like so many children, we were told stories. I was told stories by my parents, by my uncles, by my aunts, and those stories that were told to me back in the Punjab, we used to sit outside around the fire. We used to cook our food on an open stove. It's called a chulla. And after we finished eating, we'd kind of warm ourselves around like the embers that were still kind of burning and until it was time to go to sleep. And the elders would tell stories, and those stories had a very deep influence on my psyche, I'm sure. You know, as an adult, I can look back and see how those stories had such a deep impact. So stories can influence and they can shape our morality, because in a way they help us to distinguish between what is considered to be good and what is considered to be bad within our societal culture. And also those stories can, even in adulthood, they can inspire us to take various actions, you know, to behave in various ways and to aspire to, you know, to have ambition and to aspire like things that we identify with in those stories. It's almost as though seeds were planted through those stories, and those seeds in adulthood, they kind of nurture and kind of take on a life of their own. So I know that stories are, you know, really influential in that way. And as an adult, I taught for about 35 years, and in those 35 years I attended various conferences, and some of the best conferences that I attended were those that kind of, they created that same ambience, that same kind of atmosphere, that same creative space as I had experienced as a child, as a 5-year-old child, sitting around, you know, the fire. Like maybe at the conferences we weren't actually physically sitting around a fire, but when people told those stories that were inspirational, that really kind of touched me on a deep level, it was the same kind of feeling that I had as a child listening to the wisdom through the stories that my elders recounted. So attending all these conferences, especially when I started to do my creativity research, I attended a lot of conferences, and some of them were very inspirational. And the stories that were told, they, in the same way that the childhood stories helped to inspire, to influence and to shape my beliefs, so did these stories at the conferences. So I again knew that you know, there was power in those stories being told at these conferences. And the online conference, the Creativity and Culture Conference being online, it's as a response to the challenges that I faced in actually attending those conferences, even though they were very valuable, but there were various challenges. You know, for example, one of the best conferences that I attended was in California. It was very expensive to get there. We stayed in hotels. It was a wonderful place to be in, but it was thousands of miles away. And, you know, and normally when I was working as a teacher, I was not allowed to attend conferences because we were not allowed to take time off during term time, because what are the students going to do? You know, you can't just go away on a 2-3 day conference, especially never ever for a week away during time. That's when the conferences are usually organized. The conferences are organized on weekdays, or, you know, in faraway locations where you would need to take off at least 1 or 2 days of your teaching time. So the online conference was a response to overcoming all those, the challenges of time, the expense, because expense is another obstacle, especially when we're working full-time as teachers. The organization will say, well, we can't afford to pay, you know, another teacher to cover your classes, and then on top of that, pay the fees for attending that conference. So this is one of the reasons that I wanted to make sure that the online conference is free, so that it's accessible to everyone, so that finance cannot be said to be like the obstacle that's preventing people from joining. And because it's online, obviously that overcomes the challenge of distance, and we can log into it from the comfort of our own living rooms. And isn't that great? You know, rather than hours at airports, you know, catching flights and, you know, all the inconvenience of that. It's a conference that we can, so we're creating that space from our own living rooms, you know, and I think it's the nearest thing that I can create at this point in time, which takes me back to my childhood when I learned so much from my elders, you know. So that's the story behind why I decided to create the online conference, from a personal level, from a professional level. Doing my creativity research, I wanted to engage with the public, not in a unidirectional way where all I'm doing is presenting my research. You know, that's very often what happens. Academics will present their research at a conference in a unidirectional way. You know, they're saying, this is my research, here are my findings, and there's no kind of there isn't a feedback loop, there isn't this multi-directional interaction. And I wanted to have that multi-directional engagement with the public, because I believe that research needs to be alive that way, you know, not just theory. It needs to have a life. And for me, bringing the research to life is not just saying this is what I found, but it's like actually engaging everyone in co-creating the knowledge and synthesizing everything. So yeah, go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah. I think that's a magic word, isn't it? The co-creation. And obviously this is not the first conference you've run. So how many others have you run, and how have you felt running those conferences from the past?
This is the second annual conference. Last year was the first one, and last year I interviewed 30 people. 6 of them actually did presentations and 24 did only the interviews. And what I noticed is that the interviews were just as popular as the presentations. And I thought about that, you know, why would the interviews be just as popular as the presentations, which took about 6 months for those presentations to be created, because there was a lot of like editing, re-editing, feedbacks and whatever. And I think it's because of what we're doing right now. We're co-creating this conversation, and through that co-creation of a conversation there is creativity. Whereas a speech, even though we might have spent months preparing that speech, sometimes it falls flat because there isn't this, the conversation gives it life. Whereas if it's just a speech, regardless of how hard we've tried to make it conversational, it's still not really conversational. So this is why this year I focused totally on the interviews, Glenn, because yeah, so 80 interviews, and you know, there's been magic, because sometimes the conversation has gone in directions that neither of us imagined. We weren't planning those questions to emerge, and they did. So
yes. And I think as a teacher myself, and your experience too, we learn so much from the engagement process, isn't it? Which is the secret of learning, I think, being engaged. So that brings me to the next question, which is really from these digital stories that are being created and are being shared, how does you see the conference making an impact on culture and creativity?
Okay, well, my positioning in creativity research is based on the systems thinking model of creativity, which was proposed by Mahil Csikszentmihalyi. He's one of the leading researchers in creativity. He's been researching for well over 3 decades on the subject of creativity. He's a psychologist. So he proposes this model of creativity where creativity seemed to be the interaction between an individual, society and culture. And in that interaction between the individual, society and culture, my particular focus is on the relationship between gatekeepers and those who aspire to being very creative. And so in this case, with the conference, University for Life, the host for the conference is the gatekeeper, and the participants, it's this relationship between the gatekeeper and those who get to speak, basically, those who have been interviewed. The question is, well, how did they get chosen? How did they choose to take part in this conference? How were they selected? You know, so over a 5-year period, I'm going to be exploring this evolving relationship between the gatekeepers and the participants. Again, this is transforming the way things are normally done. So like normally, the conference gatekeeper won't be, they won't be as receptive to being influenced, to being changed by the participants. They remain the same. It's the participants that will be changing. So this is like what I'm trying to create is something which is more malleable, where it's, you know, the relationship between the gatekeeper and the participants is constantly evolving, and the patterns are changing. And I've noticed this, you know, this year we've got 80 people involved in the conference, whereas last year we had 30. So already something is growing, something is shifting, and next year the pattern will emerge in a different way. So I'm exploring recognition and persuasion as a, you know, over a 5-year period. How does that evolve, and who gets recognized and who is not recognized, who is persuasive and who is not persuasive with their creativity. So that's the heart of like the conference in terms of my research. But of course, this isn't like the only creativity research that I'm doing. The other research that I'm doing as a creativity researcher is exploring the role of family photographs in creating photo stories. You see? Because what I'm doing there is like transforming the way we look at families. Like normally when we look at family trees tend to be very patriarchal, linear, and focused on nuclear families, more or less. Whereas with photo stories, what I'm doing is like reconstructing, you know, like just using the images of like the extended family, and that creates this web of interconnectedness where it's not linear, it's more to do with like the strength of relationships, and it helps us to see the family from a broader perspective, and people are positioned within that family, not in a linear vertical sense, but in as a web, you know, where they can see how their relationships are from a broader perspective. So that's what I'm working on, and surprisingly very little has been written about the use of family photographs. Since I've been exploring this, there's a few books about the use of family photographs, but none of them look at the use of family photos as a way of transferring culture in, you know, through the generations. And I've started this by looking at my own family. We've been in England for 50 years now. I came as a young child, and I've looked at the photographs that we've accumulated over the 50-year period. So from 1968 to 2018, and how those photographs have, you know, the photographs that we have now are very different to the photographs that we had back in the 60s, and how can we transfer values, family values, work values, through the generations, through our photographs.
And those are very interesting connections, aren't they? And I'm sure we all do sort of think about those without really focusing as you are. And that's what's so interesting, because, you know, we all have the granny that was most influential in our life, or the uncle, or, you know, and we all have this intrinsic knowledge, but we don't actually explore it like you are. And I think that's a fascinating thing, to actually begin to prompt ourselves to think about those influences and the stories, that family stories that maybe are shared, not necessarily around the fire, but in the Christmases, or the bar mitzvahs, or the festival of lights, whatever it may be. And those stories do sort of dictate the family origins and beliefs, don't they? That's fascinating.
Yeah, and especially like from the point of view of being immigrants in a country,
Right.
the first generation, second generation, now we're on to the third generation at the moment. And so it'll be a way of like, I don't know, synthesizing the knowledge that we have like from different cultures. And I think like with creativity, there's a lot of research that's been done that shows that some of the very highly creative people tend to be immigrants because they're synthesizing two different cultures. For one thing, they have learned to survive through adaptation. They speak more than one language very often, so several languages. And so all of that, it creates a different kind of synthesis that wouldn't be possible if they had remained in their own country, speaking only one language, knowing only like, one set of, one kind of community, whereas here we're recreating different communities.
And I think if you look at the business world today, most of the large corporates are comprised of a huge variety of different cultures. And perhaps that's a secret to creativity in any environment, is to actually look for people who are totally different to you. And I read somewhere that, something new is created when two people get together who don't normally talk to each other. So that's an interesting twist on what you're saying. That, and perhaps today that's even more relevant than it has been in the past. Yeah. How do you feel about that? Yeah,
oh, definitely. And this is the reason that I'm bringing together academics, entrepreneurs, and educators, because there's a world of difference between academia and entrepreneurship. And even through organizing this conference, I've noticed, differences in attitudes between, entrepreneurs. Some entrepreneurs, when I've invited them to do these interviews with me, they've wanted to know how much they'll get paid. And that's the first question. And whereas academics don't. That's not their first motivation, is not to, how much is it going to, for the academics, it will be to do with credibility. They will become involved in a project if there is a high level of credibility, rather than how much will they get paid for it, so.
Yeah, in this case, we're being paid, if you like, in a way that we're being paid because we get fantastic experience, and as a creative experience, adding to our knowledge, which knowledge is power and knowledge is valuable too. So yes, a different academic approach.
Yes, and what we're doing, Glenn, is we're actually creating wealth. We're creating social and cultural capital. That's the way I look at it. I'm very much influenced by Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, the French sociologist. And so that was my, the rationale behind creating this conference, is that I know that we're actually creating wealth. We're co-creating wealth. And so,
wonderful.
So the way these digital videos are going to, well, my aspiration is that they will transform culture, is that over the years that, we accumulate these creativity videos, people will make new connections that they wouldn't otherwise have made, because they wouldn't otherwise have heard or watched or listened to those different ideas. So new connections will be made. There'll be a synthesis of knowledge from a very diverse range of domains, and also we're leaving a legacy for those who will come after us, in 100 years time, people that we will never meet, because we're separated from them in terms of in time and in distance. So we're creating this legacy through something which they might be able to see at a later point, whereas those stories that my uncles and my parents told me when I was a child, we didn't record them. Because we didn't record them, it's difficult to remember, you know, the full details of what they said, which is a shame. So it's overcoming that challenge of, like, that memory erases, doesn't it?
Yes, I just building on that just shortly. When I was working in South Africa for quite a long time, I was interested in the stories of the people I worked with, some of the Africans, and there was a bit of a tragedy in that some of them had gone to Christian schools and not been told their family stories. So it's vital, I think, to preserve as much as possible the stories, because they may be lost if we're not careful.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly my rationale for exploring the use of family photo stories, because it's a way of telling our own stories. You know, it's writing our own it's writing our own biographies rather than waiting for someone else to write our story for us. And it's the same with the conference. We're speaking through our own voices rather than, you know, just listening to other people's expertise, you know, just relying on those who are publishing the books or writing the journals, you know, writing in the journals. We're actually speaking, because a lot of creatives won't want to sit down and write an academic article, and yet what they have to say is just as valuable, but they, you know, they prefer to speak it rather than to write it.
Indeed, with our video abilities and the new technologies, it is so much quicker to communicate, even if we're not academics. So it's wonderful that you've organized this, and certainly I've met already, you know, connected with so many people. I would encourage so many people to be more involved, as a wonderful opportunity, you know, to pursue their creativity in whatever way is important to them. And I'm so excited and looking forward to the conference. Is there anything else that you feel people need to know?
Well, I think that one of the things that I've noticed is that when we talk about creativity, it's a little bit like talking about love. When we talk about love, everyone thinks that they know exactly what love is, and yet if you were to ask, you know, someone, what exactly do you mean by love? Everyone has a different concept of it based on their own experience, based on their own kind of level of awareness. And it's the same with creativity. Everyone seems to think that they know what creativity is. You know, hardly anyone would say, oh, I'll need to look that up in the dictionary. I don't know what creativity is. And yet when you dig down, when you actually probe, everyone has a very different notion of creativity. The academics will have a more kind of concise definition of creativity because they've spent a long time thinking about it. And, you know, over the last 6 years, I thought that there was a general consensus amongst the academics that creativity is to do with value and originality. But during this conference, Professor Fritjof Capra, who I admire greatly, he challenges that notion. He says, well, no, it doesn't have to be valuable. So I can't even say that there's general consensus amongst the academics that it has to be valuable and creative, not everyone valuable and original. Not everyone agrees with that even. So you see, what I've noticed is that we need to kind of like not assume things around creativity. We can't make assumptions that the way we think of creativity is a shared concept. So we need to not make that assumption and to ask questions. Well, what exactly do you mean when you're talking about creativity and you're making these claims about creativity? Before we can justify the claims that we're making, we need to be very clear about what it is that we're talking about.
Wonderfully said. Yes, yeah, and you know, creativity is such a. I think it's a wonderful way of putting it, because some people are creative in their minds, some people are creative physically, some people are creative in poetry, through writing, and there are so many avenues which you can put the average adjective to, isn't there? You know,
Yes.
so many different ways of defining creativity.
Yes, and we need to be clear about what it is that we mean before we make any claims about it.
Wonderful. Well,
Okay.
thank you so much. It's been wonderful talking to you, and of course, wonderful looking forward to the conference. And yes, thank you so much on my behalf, and I'm sure on many of the others, all of the others that are going to participate. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing, and we're so excited and looking forward to the conference.
Likewise. Thank you very much, Glenn. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.